Thank you, Marina. I'm sure to listen to your next radio program. That was quite stunning. And in person, it's even more impressive. And thank you, Takis, for your remarks on Europe and Greece and Europe, education and the public sector. And I'm certain that you established a perfect foundation upon which we're able to build. We're ready to move ahead to the next session. And so I would like to introduce the European Ombudsman Nikiforos Diamandouros, who also is a tenured professor of political science at the University of Athens. And I had this very much in mind when I invited Professor Diamandouros, because we have our students read books that he edited on political development in Greece and also in Southern Europe. It's extremely interesting analysis. So I'm hoping that he's able to wear two hats today, the hat of the Ombudsman, a person who's representing one of the key institutions of the European Union, and also a person who's more than capable of a keen analysis. To moderate the session, I have invited Nikos Konstandaras, the managing editor of Kathimerini, who's written a moving series of articles in English, in the English pages of Kathimerini, on what's happening in Greece. And if you haven't read them, you can start with the article that's on the website of the English version of Kathimerini, and then go backwards insofar as you're able to find them. I'm pleased that you have both accepted the invitation. We'll have a similar kind of setup here. We'll ask the Ombudsman to speak from the podium formally, and then we'll move to the armchairs. I apologize that the seats are a little bit low. I think the immediacy does offer something that you don't get if we're sitting behind the table. So, with no further ado, Professor Diamandouros, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. There we go. Thank you very much for the invitation, for the introduction, and for the comments, and particularly for giving me a chance to make a couple of preliminary remarks. I stand before you at this point as a retired tenured professor at the University of Athens, to put things straight. I also stand before you, however, primarily as European Ombudsman, and I need to clarify that the terms of my appointment make it very difficult for me to comment on political issues. Therefore, my major address to you will be on matters European, if you please, not on the political scene in Greece, however exciting and heart-rending it might be for us right now. So I want to apologize to you for that, but it is in fact a constraint that is something that I cannot in any way contravene in my formal address. I will clearly be available for comments, but I want you to appreciate the constraints in which I'm operating under. Let me just then say that I'm particularly delighted to be back in Thessaloniki, and I want to thank especially the Michael and Kitty Dukakis Center for Public and Humanitarian Service, and in particular its Executive Director, Professor David Wisner, for kindly inviting me to participate in this important event, which coincides, and you've mentioned it already, David, but I'd like to go over it, coincides with three major milestones in the history of a distinguished educational institution having deep historical roots, both in Greece and in the broader historical space of Southeastern Europe. And these are the 125th anniversary of the founding of Anatolia College, the 30th anniversary of the establishment of the American College of Thessaloniki, and thirdly, the formal inauguration of the Michael and Kitty Dukakis Center for Public and Humanitarian Service. I'm indeed pleased to note and to acknowledge that back in October 2000, I also participated in the Dukakis chair by having given a lecture at the time here, again at the invitation of Dr. Wisner, who obviously has not learned from history and has committed the second error of inviting me again. In my address today, I would like to share some reflections with you about ongoing efforts in the European Union, but also in the member states of the European Union, the United States, and also international organizations to promote better regulation and to advance reform. Better regulation might sound as a particularly boring topic, to very many of you, but it does address major aspects of reform everywhere, including Greece, and I hope that you can see it from that perspective. The economic and financial crises of the last 2 years on both sides of the Atlantic contain important lessons for regulatory policy. Most importantly, they have emphatically confirmed that markets do not exist in a vacuum or in isolation. They exist to serve a purpose, which is to deliver sustainable prosperity for all. And they do not always succeed in doing this on their own. Regulation, therefore, has a positive and necessary role to play. The crises have highlighted the need to address the problems generated by incomplete, ineffective, underperforming and failed regulatory measures and policies, and in many cases, to do so urgently. It has become increasingly clear that the way in which we regulate has a considerable impact on whether the objectives set by legislation will be met efficiently. Over the past 10 years, the European Union has developed a better regulation policy with a view to simplifying and improving existing regulation, to designing new and better regulation, and to reinforcing respect for and the effectiveness of rules, including laws. In Greece, on the other hand, the situation is regrettably very far from being satisfactory. The distinguishing features of the Greek regulatory framework are, first, a large number of very detailed specialized laws seeking to regulate every conceivable aspect of their subject matter. Second, various provisions that are scattered throughout existing legislation and regulate the same subject matter, often resulting in serious overlaps. And thirdly, outdated legislation which remains in force even though it's been overtaken by events. In my view, this triple problem of over-legislation, poor or bad legislation, and absence of legislation in the Greek legal order nurtures illegality, which takes the form variably of both illicit and illegal practices. My aim today is to put before you some reflections designed to assist Greek policymakers in their efforts to map out the road to reform, use of expression, and to identify the way out of the current problems and of the political and legal impasses facing Greek society as a whole, but individual citizens as well. I will do so by focusing on better regulation practices in the European Union and selected member states and international organizations, allowing comparisons with Greece to be drawn more by inference than through outright comment. Allow me again to say that I consider the topic of better regulation to be an important but neglected topic, which significantly ties in with the theme of this conference. Let me also pose a question here, which may very well have come up in your mind, in the minds of some of you in the audience. Given the profound political, social, economic, and I might add, moral crisis which Greece is currently facing, is this the right time for yet another proposal for reform? I would attempt to answer this by arguing that the root cause of the crisis facing Greece is inextricably linked to the structure of the Greek state and to a, with regrettably few exceptions, generally inefficient and quite often corrupt public administration at both the central and the local government levels. And I want again to note with personal enthusiasm the quality of the content of Mayor Boudaris' address to you in terms precisely of this kind of moving forward and of trying to come up with public policy that can in fact overcome this kind of problem. Regrettably again, the recruitment to the Greek public administration historically but especially over the past 3 decades, has been effected by means of non-meritocratic criteria that have in turn produced and sustained an administrative culture pervaded, again with rare, brave and lonely exceptions, by nepotism, clientelism, low skills and low morale. Hence, in my view, the need for comprehensive reform that creatively adapts best practices derived from elsewhere to Greek needs. Let me now turn to better regulation in the European Union and elsewhere. The first program to simplify and generally improve the regulatory environment in the European Union, known as Better Regulation, was inaugurated by the European Commission in the year 2002. This was an ambitious long-term program aiming to simplify and improve existing legislation, promote better drafting of new legislation, and reinforce regulatory compliance and effectiveness, while always adhering to the principle of proportionality. The ultimate objective of this program has been to cultivate a regulatory environment which protects citizens and gives European companies the scope to operate more competitively, more effectively, and more innovatively within a particularly competitive global environment. The program was devised with the aim of reducing red tape, improving the quality of legislation, and drafting laws which better correspond to the needs of consumers and businesses. The Better Regulation program combines a range of different measures and initiatives, the most important of which I shall discuss presently, at various points along a conceptual spectrum marked on the one end, by the prospective, that is, ex ante evaluation of new initiatives and proposals that are still under negotiation, and at the other end, by the retrospective, ex post evaluation of legislative acts that have already been adopted. Implementation of the Better Regulation program has brought about significant changes in the way in which the Commission maps out policies and develops legislative proposals. However, the initiative does not end there. At the end of 2009, the European Commission announced its intention to go a step beyond better regulation and to focus its efforts on what it called smart regulation, the term used in the new action plan announced last October. I would point out that the difference between these two initiatives lies in the fact that the Better Regulation initiative gave priority to the quality of new legislative proposals, while the Smart Regulation initiative aims at simplifying, evaluating, and in particular strengthening the role of stakeholders in the process of legislation. Let me now focus on the key characteristics of these two Commission initiatives. To begin with, the action plan covers the entire process of policy making and legislation, from the drafting of a new law to its application, enforcement, evaluation, and review. It is important in this context that there should be a proper assessment of the need to adopt a new legislative initiative and of the consequences of such an initiative. However, it is equally necessary to apply the existing legislation correctly and, where needed, to review it on the basis of the experience gained. Secondly, a key feature of this process is an improvement in the status of citizens and civil society. Specifically, better regulation ensures clarity as regards the applicable law and hence allows citizens to regulate their behavior accordingly. Furthermore, it guarantees transparency in the legislative process and hence makes control and participation feasible. The basic aim of the Commission's action plans is to ensure that the opinions of those who are most affected by the legislation, that is the citizens, are taken into account during the legislative process. For a number of years, the Commission has been systematically organizing public consultations. In the light of the Lisbon Treaty and within the framework of smart regulation, the Commission is committed to strengthening the participation of citizens and of civil society by extending the consultation period and by improving the procedure. Let me now look more closely at the specific measures which are being taken at the EU level to achieve the objectives I've just outlined. These measures can be subsumed into two categories. First, those that aim to simplify existing legislation, and second, those that aim to improve the legislative process and hence the quality of new legislation. As time passes, legislation becomes partly outdated or irrelevant. Existing legislation should be examined on a regular basis, so that those of its parts that fall under these categories can be repealed. To make this kind of re-examination practicable, the Commission has recourse to what it calls sunset or review clauses. Codification is the process of gathering in a single text all the amendments to legislative acts which have been approved over time. Codification helps reduce the volume of EU legislation and at the same time renders texts more readable and allows for enhanced legal clarity, thus contributing to transparency and to ease of enforcement. Upon examination of the laws and their amendments, cases of divergence and inconsistencies within a law or between laws may come to light. Therefore, in addition to gathering all the amendments into a unified text, it is sometimes necessary to revise the law. This process is, in your jargon, called recasting. A typical example of recasting can be seen in the legislation and application of the principle of equal opportunities and equal treatment for men and women in matters of employment and occupation. Directive 2006-54 EC clarified and simplified community legislation on equal treatment of men and women in matters of employment and occupation, updating the relevant legislative texts and gathering into a unified document the relevant sections of the 7 directives relating to this matter. The single text provides a coherent legal basis arising from the unified directives, which are assigned to separate chapters. The Commission undertakes to check whether the existing legislation is fit for purpose. In this process, the following factors are taken into account: the level of enforcement of the relevant legislation in the Member States, complaints and proceedings instituted in respect of infringements, consistency with other relevant regulatory acts. In 2010, evaluations began in the following 4 large policy sectors: environment, employment, social policy, and industrial policy. The Commission's aim is to carry out thorough checks in all sectors of EU activity in the years to come. Article 11 of the Treaty of the European Union requires the EU institutions, first, to give citizens and representative associations the opportunity to make known and publicly exchange their views in all areas of Union action, and second, to maintain an open, transparent, and regular dialogue with representative associations and civil society. Furthermore, the European Commission has a special duty to carry out consultations with interested parties in order to ensure that the Union's actions are consistent and transparent. The Commission attaches great importance to the question of consultation within the scope of its policy on better regulation. EU law affects all citizens without exception in all the Member States. I should add that EU law forms an integral part of the domestic legal order. It is not external law. It does not belong to the others. How citizens therefore perceive EU law as a means of strengthening their position, as a restriction, or a source of possible benefits or burdens, and whether they believe that they have a say in approving that law, are questions of the greatest importance for the Union's legitimacy and for its efficacy. Through ongoing contact and dialogue with stakeholders, be they individuals, companies, NGOs, and other civil society organizations, regional or local public authorities in the Member States, as well as academics, experts, and interested parties from third countries, the Commission is able to stay abreast of developments, requirements, and issues so that it can judge whether it is advisable to adopt European legislation in a particular sector. This dialogue takes various forms, such as green papers, white papers, announcements for workshops, standing consultative groups, and online consultations. Examples of announcements are the European Energy and Transport Forum or the European Health Forum. There are also structured procedures, such as social dialogue with trade unions and employers' organizations, and dialogue between the Commission and European and national associations of regional and local authorities. One of the most common forms of dialogue is the online public consultation, where each interested party can submit comments on a particular draft proposal being considered by the Commission. More specifically, the Commission draws up a document in which it first explains why it wishes to consider a particular issue, Second, specifies the point on which it wishes to receive contributions from interested parties. And third, sets a time limit for submitting contributions which are published on the relevant website. The Commission draws up a report containing the results of the consultation and uses the conclusions drawn from this process in the impact evaluation report. One important aim of the smart regulation initiative is to provide longer time scales for consultations, an increase from 8 weeks to 12, and to simplify procedure. I should add that the European Ombudsman contributes to public consultations carried out by the Commission on issues relating to his duties. The Ombudsman's most recent contribution concerned the review of the European Union financial regulation. Additionally, the European Ombudsman has recourse to the mechanism of public consultation, both during the examination of petitions, delays in the Commission's payments, policy on inclusion of people with special needs, and when drafting statements of public service principles and of requiring appropriate ethical behavior by civil servants. An improvement in legislation undoubtedly calls for a full assessment of the impact of any legal proposals, that is, of their economic, social, and environmental consequences. It also calls for an examination of various alternative solutions and for the selection of those solutions that are capable of delivering the best results with the fewest negative side effects. This is an approach which is knowledge-based and aims to ensure that decisions on the implementation of an initiative are based on solid data and thorough analysis of the available options. Impact assessments enable the Commission to determine whether or not it is advisable to improve the legislation at the EU level. At the same time, they serve as an aid to determining the most suitable legislative or non-legislative measure. This allows the Commission to take decisions based on a range of options, each of which has its corresponding benefits and costs. Assessments are carried out on all legislative proposals and on all other important initiatives for the adoption of public policy. Major proposals, however, are subject to a more detailed impact assessment. To strengthen the role of impact assessment, the European Commission has launched an independent external audit body, the Impact Assessment Board, which is responsible for quality control of all the impact assessments prepared by the Commission's various departments that have competence in a particular area. The Commission has also issued instructions and guidelines on the preparation of impact assessments for use by its services when engaging in this task. When drafting explanatory memoranda for its legislative proposals, the Commission focuses on 5 elements, which reflect a set model: the consultations which have been held and their results, the impact assessment which it has carried out, the grounds for selecting the measure which it is proposing, especially in respect of the principles of subsidiarity and proportionality, and lastly, the financial impact of the proposal. Let me now turn to practices from the Member States. The United Kingdom has long experience in seeking to improve legislation and legislative procedure, both through the adoption of strategic plans, through programs designed to improve legislation, and through the establishment of competent agencies. Specifically, a special service, the Better Regulation Executive, or BRE, which forms part of the Department for Business Innovation and Skills, is responsible for issues concerning the improvement of legislation at the interdepartmental level. Its aim is to improve the drafting of new laws and communications policy and to simplify and update existing legislation. The service operates on the basis of the following 5 key principles of better regulation, which state that any regulation should be transparent, accountable, proportionate, consistent, targeted. A significant innovation in British practice is the fact that businesses can, on their own initiative, contact the Better Regulation Executive, point out problems, and propose ways of improving specific legislative acts. Proposals must include a title, a description of the problem faced by the business concerned, an explanation as to whether the problem is due to contradictory legislation, suggestions for addressing the problem, ways in which the business is expected to benefit of it if its proposal is adopted, the sector affected by the problem, and the public authority which, in the view of the business concerned, is responsible for the issue. The service is required to respond to every proposal it receives within 90 days. After a preliminary check, proposals which are accepted for further examination are published on the website. For those which are rejected, the interested parties receive a reasoned and detailed reply. There is also the Regulatory Policy Committee, a government advisory body responsible for assessing the costs and benefits of legislative activity. Its mission is to ensure that when the government decides to adopt new laws, account has to be taken of all the risks, all the various alternatives, the cost, the benefits, and the wider impact of the proposed legislation at the economic, social, and environmental levels. In Sweden, to go to another member state, the utmost importance attached to the way in which laws are drafted. Clear wording or plain language is a priority. Since 1965, mechanisms have been in place for checking the wording of laws. Since 1976, this has been the responsibility of a special division of the Ministry of Justice, which, apart from checking proposed laws, holds seminars for all those engaged in the legislative process, publishes manuals and instructions, and gives advice. In practice, all draft laws are checked to ensure that they are clear, comprehensible, and reader-friendly. All those subject to the law should be able to understand, says the directive, without difficulty, what behavior is expected of them. A major goal of this initiative is to influence administrative language. If the laws are written in a clear language, says the initiative, the administrative documents enforcing them will all follow suit. Specific rules have been adopted and must be respected by those responsible for drafting laws. To give you but a few illustrative examples which might sound amusing to you, but are in fact the policy of the state of Sweden. An article of a law cannot be more than 3 paragraphs long. Each paragraph should convey a separate idea. The components of a sentence, subject, the verb, and the object, should be as close together as possible, and use of the passive voice should be avoided. The manual concerning plain language in the Swedish government is a 100-page long document, which is being adhered to with very great consistency. Let me now look to the practices adopted and promoted by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Since 1995, the OECD has been focusing on ways to improve legislation in the member states. In 1997, it adopted recommendations on improving the quality of lawmaking, and in 2005, it revised those recommendations. These recommendations and principles are mainly oriented towards the economic sphere, although some of them can be applied in all sectors. By way of an example, here are some of the general applicable principles. Adopt at the political level broad programs of regulatory reform that establish clear objectives and frameworks for implementation. Assess impacts and review regulations systematically to ensure that they meet their intended objectives in a changing and complex economic and social environment. And third, ensure that regulations and regulatory processes are transparent and non-discriminatory. In 2009, a special committee, the Regulatory Policy Committee, or RPC, was set up to assist OECD members in their efforts to improve legislation by sending experts into the countries to be able to assist them. Additionally, within the OECD framework, studies are drawn up on each country's progress and meetings are held, the minutes of which are available on the OECD website. Because time constraints are such, I will simply mention that similar practices have long also been operative in the United States, but particularly through the Freedom of Information Act that has been enforced now for 45 years. there have been a series of measures adopted that have had a major impact on reform and better regulation, also by ensuring that the practices I've just described are also being adhered to in a very, very strict way. Let me conclude now by briefly coming back to Greece and focusing on Greece. The European experience, and that of the other countries and international organizations that I have mentioned, provide, I believe, Greek policymakers with examples and practices on which they can build a strategy for escaping from the present situation and from finding the road to reform. However, a basic condition for achieving this aim is, in the final analysis, the existence, or failing this, the creation and nurturing of a public administration capable of understanding and of effectively implementing the aims embodied in a strategy leading to the road to reform. An undertaking of such magnitude necessarily requires long time frames and a great deal of advanced planning. In this context, at any rate, it would seem to me that 4 initial initiatives can help towards that end. First, substantial restructuring of recruitment structures of the public administration, making it possible to adopt flexible mechanisms for selecting personnel and efficient and systematic use of the cohorts so recruited. Second, strengthening of the National School of Public Administration and systematic deployment of its graduates in top important executive positions in the public administration. Third, the development and systematic implementation of a program of ongoing training, continuous training for the existing workforce in the public administration, which measures must be implemented consistently and without exceptions. And lastly, the establishment within the civil service of specialized units devoted to strategic planning and to quality control, including impact assessment. Ladies and gentlemen, time will tell whether Greek governments and Greek society in general have the political will and the moral commitment to respond to the challenges associated with the logic of such a strategy for better regulation, for reform, and in the final analysis, for remaining steadfastly committed to the country's European vocation. Thank you very much.